In this video, we're going to keep looking at conditional statements, and there are three different ways we can change our conditional statements around. There's the converse, inverse, and contrapositive. For this lesson, it's very important that you learn what those three different names mean and how to apply them. So let's start with this first one, the word converse. With the converse, we switch the hypothesis and the conclusion. And so hopefully remember from our previous lesson, the hypothesis is everything that comes after the if part, and the conclusion is everything that comes after the then part. So all we're going to do with a converse is we're going to take those two pieces and we're going to switch them, just like this. And so what we end up with is if you are on TikTok, then you can dance. Okay, it's that simple. All we're doing is we're taking our hypothesis and conclusion and switching them. Okay, so take the everything after the if and then everything after the then, just swap them. We're not changing any of the words, we're just taking them and switching them. So our keyword here with converse is switch. One way to think about this is if you own some Converses, the shoes, you could switch shoes to some other shoes if you wanted to, but the key word here is switch. So let's look at one more example. Let's say we want to find the converse of this. If you miss 3 practices, then you're off the team. All right, so with the converse, all we're going to do is we're going to take the if part, the hypothesis, and the conclusion. We're just going to swap them. So what we should end up with here is if you're off the team, then you missed 3 practices. And notice we did end up changing this one just a little bit. If you change the verbs around a little bit just to make it sound a little better, that's fine. Now notice, they don't always have to be true. So say you're running track. This is the policy on the track team that if you miss 3 practices, you're off the team. And so if you switch them, if you're off the team, then you miss 3 practices. Notice we just switched the 2 statements, but it doesn't mean that the meaning stays the same. You could be off the team for a lot of different reasons. It doesn't have to be from 3 practices. Maybe you quit. Maybe you switch schools, or there's lots of different reasons you could be off the team besides missing 3 practices. So don't get hung up on if it's true or not. Just focus on actually doing the thing they've asked you to do. So keyword with converse is switch. It's really important you remember that. We're going to come back to that again and again. We've got, I think, a quiz this week and a test next week. So we want to make sure that we have lots of reps on this idea. All right, let's look at inverse. So inverse, we're going to negate the hypothesis and the conclusion. Now negate, that's a new word, right? It's a fancy way for saying the word not, or you could think of it as opposite, taking the opposite. So we're going to keep the hypothesis and the conclusion in the same spot. We're not switching it. But it would turn out to something like this. If you can't dance or cannot dance, then you are not on TikTok. All right, so notice what we did here. We added the not in the hypothesis and the not in the conclusion. We need to add it in both locations. If I only added it in one or the other, that's not the inverse. If I added in both and then I switch them, that's not the inverse. Inverse is going to keep it exactly the same. Notice we did not switch, we only put nots in it. So converse, we switch the statements. Inverse, we put nots into the statements. So let's take a look at the inverse here. If you miss 3 practices, then you're off the team. So once again, we're going to put some knots in here, and let's take a look. If you don't miss 3 practices, notice the not there, then you could say not off the team. But what does not off mean? Well, it just means on. So if we have something like, if it's not equal to something, then it would be equal. Or if it is equal, sometimes what we'll do is we'll say x is equal to 3. The inverse would say x is, or the negation would be x is not equal to 3. So sometimes instead of putting a not in, we'll just do the opposite. That's why we use the word negate instead of the word opposite or not, because sometimes depending on the words. The idea being you want the exact opposites. Instead of being off the team, you're on the team. Instead of missing 3 practices, you didn't miss 3 practices. So converse, we switch, we take it, we just switch it. Inverse, we put nots into it, where we negate it. Contrapositive, now this one's kind of a real long word, right? Contrapositive, we're going to switch and we're going to negate. So we're going to switch the hypothesis and the conclusion, and then we're going to put nots into them. So here we go. If you can dance, then you're on TikTok. Here we go. If you are not on TikTok, then you can't dance. So notice what happened. My hypothesis and conclusion, they switched. I also put nots in to both of my statements. So I've got, if you're not on TikTok, then you can't dance. I've just done both. So contrapositive really doesn't bring anything new. It's just a combination of your converse and your inverse. So let's look at this last example. If you miss 3 practices, then you are off the team. So let's take a look. If you are on the team, notice team comes first because we've switched the orders here. And then instead of off, this becomes on. And instead of missing, you did not miss. So if you're on the team, then you did not miss 3 practices. All right, so let's review. Let's do all 3. So let's take this statement. If you want to, why don't you go ahead and pause the video, write out the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive. See if you can get all 3 of them. So we're going to run through this. The converse, our keyword is switch. So the converse of the statement is if it's a right angle, then the angle is 90 degrees. Notice we've switched the statements. The inverse, we're going to put nots or negate it. If the angle is not 90 degrees, then it is not right. Okay, so notice we've put nots into there. And then contrapositive, we're going to do both. So notice we switch it. So right angle comes first, 90 degrees comes second, and then we put our nots in. If an angle is not right, then it is not 90 degrees. So let me show you your assignment, and then let me give you a sheet that might be helpful for you when doing this work. So your assignment is IXL I5. You need to get to 82. And all it is it'll give you like 2 statements and say, is this the converse, inverse, or contrapositive? Or it will say which one is the converse of this statement. You have to choose the correct statement. It does take some reading. So just take your time, make sure you're paying attention because they look the same, but they aren't the same. All right, so if this helps you, here's a final chart to review. So conditional, this is my original statement, right? If I go across here, it's like I'm flipping it. I'm switching the sign. So I'm switching the sign. Going down is negating. So if I'm going to the contrapositive, I'm doing both. I'm going to switch it and put the knots in it, or you can think about it as putting the knots in and then switching it. Either way will get you there. So contrapositive kind of takes 2 steps to get there, but your converse, you either switch, inverse, you negate. These are key words that you should know for each one. If I say converse, you should be thinking switch. If I say inverse, you should think negate. If I say contrapositive, you should be thinking both. Hopefully this is helpful. As always, if you have any questions, shoot me an email.